Good afternoon. We are 3 for 4. I'm sure Senator Rosebud will be joining us soon. Welcome to the PSTE Subcommittee. We're hearing 3 budgets today. First is the Maryland Department of Transportation overview, then the Maryland Department of Transportation Motor Vehicle Administration, and then last but certainly not least, Department of Agriculture. So we will go in that order. And first we have our friend Stephen McCulloch to talk to us about MDOT's budget.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. You should have a document in front of you entitled Maryland Department of Transportation Fiscal 2025 Overview. Beginning on page 2, the chart there shows that the overall budget, this is operating and capital, increases by $272 million to $6.2 billion in the 2025 allowance. On page 4, overview of the trust fund. As you know, I'm sure, the trust fund is a non-lapsing special fund that collects all the revenues, transportation related revenues and other revenues, and then is used to pay out for the debt service operations and capital program for the Department of Transportation and all its modal administrations. On page 5, we have Exhibit 1. We've covered things about, the impact of COVID, and for many parts of the state, things are kind of returning to normal. For transportation, there are 2 main areas that are still kind of lingering. One is the transit services haven't returned to pre-COVID levels, and that combined with the reduced revenues from fares puts pressure on that. But Exhibit 1 shows the federal COVID aid that had been received and used in the department's budgets for fiscal 2020 through 2024, which is the last year any of that funding remains. And the need to backfill this nearly $1.8 billion of operating is one of the significant stressors on, the transportation program and maintaining the capital program at the level that people would like to see. Exhibit 2 on page 6 shows the trust fund closeout for this is just state funds with federal operating assistance, since that kind of is bolsters the state funds. But you can see from that exhibit that the trust fund closed out with a balance of $822 million at the end of fiscal 2023. That was an increase of $275 million over the projected closeout this time last year. The major driving factors of that was that federal COVID aid that was kind of replacing the need for some of that. That 822, as you'll see in a few minutes, rolls into the beginning of this year and gets spent out through the rest of the program. 2024 year-to-date revenues through September were down slightly for the big 3 revenue sources to the trust fund, state sources, those being the motor fuel tax, registrations, and titling. Combined, there was about $18.8 million short underattainment based on 5-year average attainment rates. Should that underattainment continue for the rest of the fiscal year, that would be about $100 million underattainment by the end for the whole fiscal year. However, I should note that we have been in that situation before where at this point in the year, we're showing, a possible underattainment and things pick up and meet the target or exceed it slightly. On page 8, Exhibit 3 shows the trust fund revenue sources, and you can see that the largest 3 sources, this is for operating and capital, are the motor fuel tax, federal capital aid, and titling tax. Those three sources account for about 61% of the revenues for this 6-year period. On page 9 shows the year-by-year summary, and you can see at the top of the 2024 column, there's the $822 million starting balance. The next section of that table shows the revenues that are coming in, and below that is the expenditures. And the expenditures are laid out pretty much in the waterfall of uses. Debt service is paid first, operating expenses for the department is paid next, and then whatever remains from the state funds goes to the capital program. Unlike, and there will be an issue on this, but I'll just point out in terms of reading this table, at the bottom of the expenditures, the state capital available for state capital, that's the funds available to state funds to pay for the capital program. Under the capital summary, those first 2 lines are those state capital. It's the state capital for the department itself, and then the state aid that we pay out to the locals. Those two lines equal in each year that state capital aid available up above, which means that this CTP and financial forecast are balanced in each year, unlike the discussions we've been having since last September when the draft came out, and that line of funds available was $2.1 billion less than was showing in the expenditure or programmed expenditure line. On page 10, Exhibit 5 shows the 6-year programmed funding by source. You can see that federal funds is the largest single source. However, if you combine all of the state funds, that equates to about 49% of the funding over the 6-year program. Exhibit 6 on page 11 looks at a comparison of the capital program only for the 5 years that 2024 program overlaps the 2023. This is being 2024 to 2028. That makes it an apples to apples comparison. And you can see that the capital program is only $19 million less over this 5-year period than it was in last January's program. However, if you look at the allocation by mode, you can see that there was a lot of movement between modes. The most dramatic one being the reduction in the state highway administration capital program. And then you can see the other modes basically picked up, that funding. On page 12, Exhibit 7 shows the 6-year spending by investment category. So these are the categories of the capital program. You can see the largest source there is system preservation, which largely mirrors state of good repair. So a lot of times we're now using those two terms interchangeably, but that's still the largest category programmed for the program. On page 13, Exhibit 8 shows the state and federal funded capital program going back to 2010 through 2023. Those are actuals, and then 25 through 29, those are the projection. And you can see that over this period, the capital program really ramped up back in 2013. That's when the last motor fuel tax increase that allowed more debt to be issued to support the program. And you can see it ramped up. We're now facing, in a situation where the debt limits are, being constrained on how much can be issued with debt service coverage ratios. And also 23 also was less in terms of the closeout for cash flow. The program is expected to exceed $3 billion in the current or in the budget year, fiscal 2025, and peak in 2026, and then it declines. And you can see that the bottom set of bars, the special funds, that is a large driver of that decline. On page 14, Exhibit 9 shows the uses of the trust fund in 2025. So basically, we've been talking about 5 and 6 year comparisons. We're now starting to focus on the budget year, fiscal 2025. And in 2025, the uses of the trust fund are about split equally between operating and capital, with debt service, state aid, and the deductions of other agencies, being the remainder of that piece of pie. On page 15, Exhibit 10 is the comparison that you see for kind of all budgets when you come before. It shows the 23 actual, the current year working appropriation, and the 25 allowance. So this shows it by mode for both operating, capital, and it also breaks out debt service and the state aid. I will just note that in the WMATA line, you'll see a large increase, 34.5%. For this purposes of this table, in order to match some of the tables we had for the fiscal briefing, we've included the $150 million that's in the dedicated purpose account. It has not yet been appropriated, so it's really, that's a technical fix, but that shows the impact of bringing that in, and we'll have more to discuss when we get to the WMATA budget analysis. On page 17, Exhibit 11 shows the operating budget allowance by mode. For the operating side of things, transit, the combination of both MTA and WMATA makes up about 64% of total operating spending. On page 18, Exhibit 12 shows the position count for the department. In the allowance, the department is gaining 121 additional positions. There are also some interagency transfers. So, for example, you see the Secretary's Office lost 8 positions. Those did not go away. They were just transferred to other units. And then the big unit receiving positions in the allowance is the transit administration. These are the 108 positions created in order to improve transit service in the Baltimore region. And then MTA also got one of those transferred positions from the Secretary's office. On page 19, Exhibit 13 shows the highway user capital grants. Again, 23, 24, and 25. The 25 allowance increases by $61.2 million over the current year. This is the full allowance that is current law. Back in January, or excuse me, last month, December, the department had announced, its intention of making a cut to the highway user revenues in 2025 through 2027. The governor's $150 million that he added allowed restoration of operating plus these highway user grants and MTA capital grants for state of good repair. So the 2025 allowance reflects the fact that in current law, the local share increases between 24 and 25 from 15.6 to 18%, and that's that increase. On page 20, Exhibit 14 shows the capital funding by mode. And here it's a little different from the operating side, where transit is very labor intensive, and so it has a large operating impact. On capital side of things, state highway is the largest share of the capital pie, slightly exceeding the combined MTA and WMATA transit at 32%. Page 22, Exhibit 15. This is the first year funding table. Back in 2022, you passed legislation requiring the CTP to include an identification of projects that were receiving construction or design funding for the first time. The reason being, with the ability for the General Assembly now to move appropriations around, these funds would be the kind of the target list of places where things could be reduced to add things you wanted without impacting a project that was under construction, which is very disruptive and very costly. In each of the modal budget analyses, you will have more detail on that, including project lists, so you can see what those first year projects are. Exhibit 16 is an annual exhibit showing the other funds for the capital program. So historically, other funds have been funds that do not flow through the state budget. These are things like you see on the bottom of page 23 for the aviation administration. A lot of the passenger facility charge and customer facility charges used to support revenue debt do not flow through the budget, but they are shown as other funds when expended in the capital budget. In recent years, the general funds and general obligation bonds that have been approved to also support various projects have been showing up in this list. So it's no longer a strictly not in the budget, because the GO bonds and the general funds do flow through the state budget. The first issue on page 25 is the fact that the Consolidated Transportation Program aligns capital spending with available resources. That's what I mentioned back on the trust fund chart. On page 26 is kind of one of those waterfall charts that show, how this was accomplished from the September draft, where there was a $2.1 billion shortfall, to the final draft issued this beginning of this month that had no shortfall. This is comparing only 5-year, again, overlap. And so that $2.1 billion shortfall for that 5 years was 1.6, which is the first column. Things got worse when in terms of the shortfall, or the need to solve the shortfall, when the additional operating support over the 25 through 29 was added in for WMATA. That increased the deficit. General fund transfers decreased slightly in the 25 and 26. The $167 million that has been in the dedicated purposes general funds to support the dedicated grant to WMATA have been shifted over to general obligation bond funding. And so that shows the decrease on there, only slightly offset by the $150 million that the governor included in 2025 only. And then the blue bars show the rest of the actions that helped kind of close that gap. There were, just the the normal re-estimating of what current revenues are. Those go up a little. The federal funding, operating assistance went up a bit. They're able to issue a few more bonds than they had projected in last year's program. There's a new fee revenue bar. This is $81 million a year that's assumed in the financial plan. These are fees that the department has its authority to either raise administratively or through regulatory action. MDOT has indicated that they expect about $40 million in MVA fees annually, $30 million in aviation administration fees, primarily, parking at the airport, and then $11 million for the port operations as the fees that it charges. And then the final two columns are the other actions that you probably have heard most about and have most concern, and those were ongoing operating reductions that the department made and the capital reductions of $1.2 billion compared to September that needed to be made in order to balance and align spending with the available resources. We'll note that on page 28 shows the reductions that were made by the department and the restorations. So the $150 million did for fiscal 2024 only, or excuse me, 2025 only, kind of back up, some of those reductions. It reinstated the highway user, the locally operated transit system, and some of the other operating reductions in the department that the department felt were the most needful to be brought back. However, this reprieve is only temporary because the financial plan does include those cost savings in 26 through 29. So unless other kind of equal cuts can be identified or offsetting revenues can be identified in 2026, we're going to be right back here, maybe talking about the same things being cut that, people have concerns with. So that is that for that issue. And my colleague Carrie is going to present the second issue.
Thank you for indulging our musical chairs, Madam Chair. So the second issue, beginning on page 29, just deals with the highway safety issues throughout the state. So obviously the tragic crash on I-695 in March resulted in the fatalities of 6 construction workers. So the governor convened the Work Zone Safety Work Group, and they released a report in November. What the work group did is they studied sort of 2 facets. One is behavior of drivers. So things like education campaigns, increased enforcement for violations. And then the other side is the roadway operations. So what barriers are we physically putting in between those construction workers and motorists on the road, as well as other technical and infrastructure improvements. So there were a few recommendations that the work group released that will require legislation to implement, and we've just touched on them here on page 30, including expanding the use of automated speed enforcement, increasing the citation amount for speeding in a work zone, which is currently one of the lowest rates in the country, and creating a memorial site for workers that were killed and in crashes. And I believe the department is going to touch on a bill that has been introduced that addresses some of these issues as well. In terms of the ongoing road safety efforts, that is headed by the Maryland Highway Safety Office, which is within MVA, and they're a collaborative office. They work with all the MDOT modes as well as state police and many other agencies throughout the state. Page 31 shows some data from the fatal crash dashboard that they released in 2022. So this actually gives you data on fatal crashes throughout the state, and if pedestrians were involved, cyclists, motorcyclists, the time of day. There's a lot of information on there. They get that information from the state police and those crash investigations. So it's really helpful information. So we've just pulled some of that here. Exhibit 19 is total fatalities from motor vehicle crashes from 2016 to 2023. 2023 is a preliminary number, but you can see it is looking like it is going to be very close or exceed 600 fatalities in 2023. And then that orange line is fatalities per 100 million miles traveled. So that's sort of an adjusted figure. You can see the spike there in calendar 2020, and that's due to the reduced amount of drivers that were on the road due to the pandemic, but those fatalities were still at a similar level. Exhibit 20 on page 32 is the fatal crashes by related factor. So this here is really getting at the Highway Safety Office's emphasis that every crash is preventable, right? So when we look at these fatal crashes, we're seeing conscious behaviors on the part of drivers and occupants. So you can see here that in 2023, over 40% of fatal crashes were related with distracted driving. And almost 30% with unrestrained occupants. We have aggressive driving, impaired and speed related fatal crashes as well. And I also just wanted to note that these categories are not mutually exclusive, right? So there could be one crash that had multiple of these factors involved. The last item here on this issue is what we call vulnerable road users. So these are folks like pedestrians, cyclists, and motorcyclists that are disproportionately likely to be killed or seriously injured in an incident. So just to kind of give you an example, in 2022, pedestrians were involved in about 3% of all crashes, but accounted for 23% of all fatalities. Exhibit 21 on page 33 is just giving you, again, some data from that dashboard related to pedestrian and cyclist total crashes and fatalities. So you can see here that the numbers are fairly stable, and you do see, again, a little bit of a spike there in 2020, despite the fact that there were fewer motorists on the road. Finally, in April of 2022, the Highway Safety Office decided to undergo a federal review from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So they actually looked at the entire program, came up with some recommendations for them to improve the program, specifically for those vulnerable road users. And they identified 59 recommendations and 21 were identified as priorities. So we've just asked the department to comment on the status of implementing those priority recommendations, as well as implementing the recommendations from the Governor's Work Zone Safety Work Group.
Then the final issue is on page 34. This is an update of the train commission work. You had a briefing in the full committee, so unless there are questions, I'll skip that and go to the recommendations on page 35, which is annual budgetable language requiring notification of changes to the capital program. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Stephen and Carrie. Questions for our analysts before we have the secretary comment? Okay, Mr. Secretary, floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. For the record, Paul Wiedefeld, Secretary of Transportation. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss MDOT's budget. And thank you, Steve, obviously, for the thorough work that you do, and particularly your understanding of the funding challenges that we're facing as a department and as a state. Let me begin by saying that building a transportation network for the future while preserving and maintaining the existing system that we have, our multi-billion-dollar system, takes tremendous investment, and over the years we've made that investment. Unfortunately, there are several pressures on the Transportation Trust Fund which impact our bottom line. These pressures include historic inflation that we've all been going through, increasing costs of labor and materials, and a negative outlook for a major revenue source of the Transportation Trust Fund, particularly the motor fuel tax. The stress on the trust fund is not new. DLS highlighted the funding concerns during the 2019 legislative session. However, the negative impacts of these pressures on the Transportation Trust Fund were reduced over the last several years as we benefit from over $3 billion in federal COVID relief funds, particularly for transit systems in the Baltimore, Washington metropolitan areas. These COVID funds were given to ensure that transit systems would continue to provide critical transit services throughout the pandemic to ensure that essential workers could get to their jobs. The funds were also meant to offset the reduction in revenue from the decreased ridership that was occurring at the same time the operating costs were increasing. These COVID relief funds are no longer available for the fiscal year 25 and beyond, as those funds have dried up. In addition, we are seeing revenues from the fuel tax decline over time because of the increased fuel efficiency of all vehicles and the rise of the number of electric vehicles. While this is great for consumers and the environment, it's challenging for our budget. Specifically, when you consider that 21% of the Transportation Trust Fund is supported by the motor fuel tax, it becomes a structural funding issue for the Transportation Trust Fund into the future. Another major pressure on the Transportation Trust Fund, its ability to deliver needed capital projects, is the fact that MDOT's revenues are expected to grow by only 1% annually, while operating costs will be increasing by roughly 7% over the program period. This has a twofold impact on the capital program. Since operating expenses are funded before capital projects, any increase in operating budget reduces available state funding for capital projects. And as operating expenses increase, it reduces our ability to issue additional bonds to help fund the capital program. As a result of all these financial pressures that I've outlined, our updated budget plan in December revealed a shortfall of roughly $3.3 billion, resulting in significant cuts in the 6-year capital budget. Understandably, many may be wondering why MDOT must make budget cuts when President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law is making billions of dollars available to the state of Maryland and across the country. The reality is we put up matching state dollars to compete for federal grants, and if awarded these grants, these funds must be used for that specific project. So basically, it's taking the state dollar, driving the state dollars further down for other needs. Despite these challenges, we are still delivering a significant capital program to improve our transportation system. The final CTP includes $20.2 billion of investment over the next 6 years. This will advance major projects such as the Baltimore Red Line, planning to replace the American Legion Bridge, supporting the new FBI headquarters in Greenbelt, and studying potential rapid transit in Southern Maryland. We will also maintain funding for safety programs and the planning and engineering for major expansion projects, particularly some of the ones that were just noted in terms of Vision Zero. In addition, with the infusion of the $150 million proposed in the Governor Moore's recently announced budget, MDOT is committed to funding critical needs in fiscal year 25. This includes fully restoring the highway user revenue funding, fully restoring the locally operated transit system operating grants, maintaining service on commuter buses with the highest ridership routes, funding for critical state of good repair needs at the Maryland Transit Administration to meet required funding levels under the Transit Safety and Investment Act, and maintaining motor vehicle branch hours and limited service branches. This one-time $150 million budget restoration will help relieve pressures in fiscal year 25 on the state's Transportation Trust Fund, but it is important to note that this is only a one-year fix, and these issues will return next year if larger funding issues are not addressed. Turning to the DLS analysis, we were asked to address 3 issues. The first issue was to address the funding challenges, which I just spoke about. The second issue is regarding work zone safety. Again, following the tragic crash on I-695, where we did lose 6 highway workers, the governor did convene the work zone safety work group, identify ways to improve work zone safety. It released its report in November 23, containing recommendations related to changing driver behavior and improving the safety of the roadway operations. Work group recommendations aimed at changing driver behavior included education and public awareness campaigns and increased enforcement of traffic law violations. Work group recommendations to improve the safety of roadway operations included enhanced training and certification for those performing the work along our roads, more frequent implementation of additional lane closures, updates to state highways work zone inspection program, and work zone constructability reviews. We immediately implemented some of these recommendations, including increasing the presence of Maryland State troopers in work zones and increasing the use of variable speed limits and speed feedback signs. The Maryland Road Worker Protection Act of 2024 was introduced this session, allow flexibility with different types of technology and deployment strategies for automated speed enforcement systems and increasing the citation amounts for speeding in work zones. We look forward to working with the legislature to pass this important legislation. The final issue we were asked to comment on is the Train Commission. The department's worked closely with the commission over the last 6 months and will continue to do so in the coming year. The commission still has several topics they would like to address in 24, and will support those efforts as needed. And I actually sit on the board, as well as Chrissy Nizer from MVA, as well as Holly Arnold from MTA. In closing, please, I do want to let everyone know that we totally understand the impact of the budget and the implications it has, particularly for some of our users of the system. That was the thinking behind bringing back some of the things that we did bring back. But we are committed to being strategic and thoughtful with every available resources that we do have. Moving forward, MDOT will work with our legislative partners to address future budget impacts. Following this legislative session, the Transportation Revenue Infrastructure Needs Commission will resume meeting to continue their work. We look forward to that. And I want to acknowledge and thank the committee and the legislature for being tremendous partners. The conversations like the one we are having and we're going to have here today are important steps toward building and rebuilding a program that meets and hopefully exceeds Maryland transportation's needs. And finally, the DLS analysis include one recommendation for language regarding reports on capital budget changes, and we concur with that recommendation. That concludes my remarks. Be glad to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And this is the first time you're in front of us, but I think 6 or 7 times back. So just remind the committee that we're going to have a couple bites at this apple. I hope today is just the beginning of the conversation. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your thorough response and overview. I just have one question. As we move forward and restoring, the 150 million is a start, obviously. And in regards to the MTA bus services to and from the workplace for folks, at its height and most efficient manner, it allowed for flexibility for employees. It wasn't just getting you there at 8 a.m. in the morning and then picking you up at 5 p.m. We would love to, work with you and at least have some insight on, or as we're continuing this process and trying to ensure the sustainability of it, that the flexibility components of it are known. That's important for us. So
Thanks, Senator. Yes, the general approach we're facing there that we're following is first, geographically, let's try to maintain service across all the geographic areas we're serving today. Obviously, we have to look at the ridership and the performance of that. But you raise a very good point, which is that it's not just the 9 to 5 portion of it, and it offered the benefit of if something were to happen today, you could get home, which then allows the ridership to grow. So we have to look at that, and then obviously the equity portion of it, making sure that we're not impacting communities that need it the most. So that process goes through a public process. It will be starting soon. So your involvement with that obviously would be beneficial as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Hi, Senator.
Couple things. You're doing big picture here.
Mm-hmm.
One is, and I'm raising this to everybody in every agency. We know we got to deal with revenue, general fund, transportation trust fund, but I think we also need to look at long-term efforts to bend the cost curves, mm-hmm. and not just cutting back services, but thinking in a way that we sometimes do, but not often enough, about how with changes in technology, with changes in culture, we can meet the needs more efficiently. And so one of the things I'd ask you to do and your team to do as you come back for the individual hearings, and beyond the session, ideas of long-term ways to do things we do more efficiently. I can give you examples in other fields. You know the examples in your own fields. But sometimes we've done it that way for 40 years, and we thought about doing it another way, but we don't have a rule for that, or we don't know exactly how to do that, or it's not in the statute. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I'm asking for, is thinking outside the box. And this could be at the port, this could be in transit, this could be in highways. Just to kind of put that on your agenda, so that as we're looking at it, trying to solve this problem, we're looking at saving money as well as raising money. Second thing is, and again, this is maybe for a future, is, and maybe for the commission more than for you individually, but I'm just curious, but you know a lot about transportation. Are there major sources of revenue that other states use for transportation that we don't? Or we're pretty typical?
We're fairly typical, but at the end of the day, when you look at the uniqueness of Maryland supporting 2 transit systems without a dedicated funding source, and so you look across the country at the those major systems, they generally look to some other source, primarily sales tax, some sort of relation to that, because it's not only having the taxing ability, but a source that grows, given some of the nature of it's an operating business first and then a capital business.
So that would be the major difference in other places for
at a high level. Yeah,
that was the question I was asking. Okay, again, the Train Commission will deal with that, but I think it's important for us to start understanding what those are. The last thing I just want to say, and again, I'd like to hear more as we get the individual agencies, is we talked last year about apprenticeships and dealing with workforce shortages, and I know specifically that I've heard more recently about transportation is really taking a lead in this area, but I'd love to hear from folks explain what has happened in the last year and what's in the works in terms of using apprenticeships to move in that direction.
Sure, just very quickly, in our supplemental budget, we've asked for 15 additional pins for apprenticeships. We've been working with Amalgamated Transit Union up in Baltimore to get the workforce there ready to basically deal with the electrification of the fleet. And then we're working with CCB up in Baltimore as well to get even younger people some apprenticeships. So we needed the pins to do that. So even with these pressures, we're also got to think long term. And it gets at some of these efficiency things in your first question, is that's how you get more efficient if you have that up front and not have to pay for it later.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for all the information. And I know how important it is for our safe work zones and how much more we need to do. The presence of, our law enforcement, I think makes a difference. And also making sure that we put the safe colors that are out there that I believe make it more aware that it's a safe zone. And it was, again, a tragedy to see what happened there. Is this something that we're going to see from now on? That's, I believe, is necessary, and it's important because we want our workers to be safe. We want people that are driving by, they're also safe too. But those safe work zones are imperative. So I just want to make sure that this is something that we're doing. And if we need to do more, we're looking to see more safe work areas or best practices, which we look at. What's something else more we can do possibly?
No, it's definitely, this is just a course of doing business going forward, to be frank. And there's some things in the bill that we're asking for that we will need legislative approval on. And also, again, it really does touch upon some of the issues raised by Senator Roosevelt. Is technology can do a lot for us in that arena. Because a lot of it, if you have police, there's manpower and labor. So there's some technology things you can do in addition to the police. And that's what a lot of that bill calls for, is gives us the ability to do that. So that's, and again, it's a cultural change, and it's not just with us, meaning the department, but it's working hand in glove with the construction community, the engineering community, even how we think about how we set these things up. And then when they're out there, what they do. Unfortunately, in a lot of operation businesses, over time, people get used to doing something and they lose sight of the risk of what they do. And we've got to reinforce that constantly.
Well, I just believe our contractors, if they're trained the right way, hopefully they'll follow suit. We have a lot of contractors doing a lot of work out there. So having those safety moments with them to give them an opportunity to make sure we have clarity. This is exactly how we work. Our contractors are going to work this way. We're going to be a safe working environment. And this is the way we do that. There's consequences otherwise, which I think is important because that's what safety is all about. It's first. And we kind of talked about this a little bit about increased fees. Is there an area where we went to, we're going to say, this is what we're going to do possibly, or we're still looking into that? Because we kind of talked about this in my area, the Key Bridge. It's an area where people live in my area, and it's where they go. From where they leave, they go around that, across that bridge. Right. We just want that to be a burdensome or a problem, but there's something that we're looking at, I guess we can say, for a cost.
I'm sorry, are you referring to work zone or
No,
fees in general?
the fees
The fees that
tolls.
I'm sorry. No, the toll issue obviously is a separate, that will be done through the toll authority. They have, under their trust agreement, they have to basically have the budget balance. So that will be an issue into the future. Right now, there's not anything on the immediate horizon, but it is an issue in the out years, obviously, as costs go up, as it's done in the past. But right now, nothing, the fees that we're talking about, and Christy Nizer may talk a little bit more about this, is there's MBA fees that we create that a lot of them under legislative requirements that require roughly 95%, and we slipped over time to 80%. So we're trying to bring those back up. And the other portion of that is at the airport. The parking fees, where they again have not been touched for a number of years, and our competitors at Reagan and Dulles in Philadelphia are much higher than us. So,
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I just have a couple of questions that I'll put, also thoughts that I'll put as questions. I think you heard, based on the full committee briefing the other day, a lot of consternation around, I think, the process over the last year. And this might be the last time I say this. We appreciate that you inherited a lot of the challenges that you have. Pretty soon we're all going to have to own them, but you did inherit a lot, particularly the federal cliff. Certainly a lot of things put into the CTP at the last minute that might not be sustainable, but it's caused quite a bit of consternation among our colleagues. And so I do just want to reemphasize, particularly, and you've mentioned a couple, the American Legion Bridge, the Governor Thomas Johnson Bridge, I-81. We are not hearing, we hear quite a bit from our colleagues across the state about some of these projects. And so I think if we can just think about the approach over the next year, with the roadshow and things like that, I think we could calm some tension down with that. Two questions. I'll start with a somewhat easy one. We heard about this a bit when we were debating during the height of COVID and debating the 1 month freeze we had on the gas tax. We heard from a lot of the private industry who does road work, the increasing cost of asphalt and labor and things like that. I think it'd be really helpful if your team could put together just for us a basic understanding of the capital side of the cost increases based on supply and labor. I think that'd be really helpful for us to appreciate that we're just not keeping pace with it in a number of ways. We talk about it a little bit, Steve, but I wonder if we could help with that. I just think it's really important that we have that idea of it's just unsustainable, the pace that we're going on.
Right.
Okay. And then secondly, based on the projects I just mentioned, I believe all of them are relatively high up in federal funding opportunities. Are you taking that into account when you're thinking about what we can salvage based on the budget? How are you prioritizing those federal funding opportunities in terms of, I believe I-81 has a greater ratio of federal funding than state. So how are you baking that into your decision making? And then secondary question is how closely is your team working with our congressional delegation on those issues?
Let me start with the congressional one first, because we have an excellent relationship with them. We're very fortunate in this state to have pretty much everyone all on the same team. So really, we've done very well, to be frank, and because of that relationship and because of the nature of the state, so that we continue to do that. So I see I deal with the delegation, regularly, once a week type regularly. So no issues there. In terms of the way that we think about federal dollars, there's, we have the formula dollars and then we have the discretionary. So the discretionary generally are competitive. And then you're going after those. And once you get those, you're locked into that project. You can't move that federal dollar somewhere else. And some of those have requirements around them. So they're not even in play for some projects. So you have to play by the rules for that. So that's what we'll continue to do. We're not going to back away from the opportunity for discretionary dollars, because you can get anywhere from 90 cents on the dollar down to 50 cents on the dollar. So it just makes good business sense to do that. So we'll continue to do that. If I could, and you were at the larger committee the other day, and when we went out in September, actually in Mako, when we talked about this, I put on myself, I maybe should have been a little clearer. I thought talking about a $2 billion hole and talking about the fiscal cliff in Metro, I probably should draw the dots a little closer for people to understand, really what that meant in terms of projects. I did lay out our philosophy, which is safety first, preservation, then expansion. So obviously we're going to have to pull anything on the expansion side down first. But I was not as clear as maybe I could have been in that, which I think is some of what you're hearing. The other thing is there is not, when I look around the program, the cuts we've made, there isn't a question of need or desire to do those projects. It's a financial, hurdle we have to get over. 81 is a perfect example. 15, again, these are major projects that have issues that we have to deal with. There's a number throughout the state, that we have to do. So we will have to do better, obviously, in this upcoming cycle to make sure that we're clear on what we're communicating on that.
Okay. I'd ask if you just keep the senators from those parts of the state most impacted as close as possible.
We'll do.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I have a number of folks signed up to testify. Would you mind staying and hearing them as well? Okay. Thank you. We're going to bring you up two at a time, and we have sticking to full committee rules. Ask you stick to 2 minutes, please. First, we have Nick Henninger Ayub, and then Brian Ditzler.
Good afternoon. Esteemed senators, Madam Chair, Mr. Secretary, department leaders, and guests. Pardon me 1 second. Computer issues. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the impact of MDOT's budget on Baltimore's transit future. The Greater Baltimore Committee, the Greater Washington Partnership, and more than 70 regional businesses and institutions agree that creating a brighter transit future for Baltimore will require 6 things. First, bringing MDOT MTA into good repair and overcoming its staffing shortages. Second, establishing frequent, reliable transit service to regional job centers. Number 3, enhancing regional coordination, decision-making, and funding. Number 4, executing a 10-year rapid transit expansion program. Number 5, delivering the benefits of regional rail. And number 6, spurring equitable development along transit and rail corridors. The current CTP, despite the governor's one-time injection of rainy day funds, represents an unacceptable 6-year outlook for Baltimore's transit future that will stymie the region's ability to maintain, plan for, and build the transit system that current residents and businesses deserve and prospective residents and businesses require. We are particularly concerned by long-run reductions to MTA and local transit systems preservation funds, harming the state of good repair. And we know that we cannot successfully expand the system with transformative regional projects like the Red Line and the North-South Line if we allow the foundation of the system to decay. Secondly, we are concerned by long-run cuts in highway user revenue funding, which is already well below pre-recession levels and negatively impacts Baltimore City's ability to implement any large redevelopment initiative. And third, we are very concerned by the elimination of some service routes to commuter buses, which could harm our FTA scoring for the Red Line, the North-South Line, and other projects requiring federal funding. The Greater Baltimore Committee is confident that the Maryland General Assembly, the Train Commission, and MDOT are fully capable of addressing Maryland's near and long-term funding shortfalls through new revenue. And we look forward to reviewing legislative proposals that will source new revenue, which, once leveraged, can lead to billions of dollars in new investment and expansion in Baltimore's transit future. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Ditzler, and I'm testifying on behalf of the Maryland Advocates for Sustainable Transportation, a coalition of more than 20 advocacy groups in the state. The transportation sector is the primary contributor to climate-damaging greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland, with most emissions, more than 80%, coming from cars and trucks. MDOT readily admits increased use of zero-emission vehicles alone will not get the needed reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Maryland's recently released Climate Pollution Reduction Act states, quote, "Reducing projected traffic on Maryland's roads is crucial to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector," end quote. Unfortunately, MDOT's proposed 6-year budget seems to ignore that reality. The governor and Secretary Wiedefeld have spoken about building the Red Line in Baltimore, the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit Line, replacing the American Legion Bridge and adding 4 lanes to I-495 and I-270. The first 2 projects make sense because they're equitable, very much needed, and would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other harmful pollution. Not so the latter project, as it would not be equitable, would be very environmentally damaging, and would not solve traffic congestion because it would move traffic bottlenecks from Northern Virginia to Maryland and would attract drivers, which would result in continued congestion and increased greenhouse gas emissions. Despite this, MDOT's budget still has $108 million dedicated to expanding I-495 and I-270 and replacing the American Legion Bridge, when those funds are needed for the Red Line and other critical transportation needs across the state. Devoting $108 million to that highway project clearly is unwarranted in a budget that calls for 8% across-the-board cuts to all MDOT agencies to address its $3.15 billion shortfall. Those cuts will have a particularly adverse effect on public transit, the very type of equitable and sustainable transportation that needs to be improved and expanded. In summary, please prioritize spending in the MDOT budget to where it's needed the most, maintaining and expanding transit and transit-oriented development, not expanding highways.
Thank you both for being here. We appreciate your input. Next, I have Barbara Koffel and Brian O'Malley, followed by Josh Tolkien.
Hi there. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Barbara Sofel, and I'm Chair of Citizens Against Beltway Expansion, a grassroots community organization. I'm sure you all have concerns about the transportation needs that are facing cuts. On the other hand, the CTP includes $108 million for an unpopular project to add toll lanes to the I-495, I-270 corridor. In addition to being controversial, the toll lanes would hinder the state's climate goals, increase air and water pollution, and would not actually solve congestion. According to the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, adding toll lanes would just move the bottlenecks. Choke points occur where toll lanes end and traffic must merge into general lanes. In Virginia, these choke points have led to extensions of toll lanes on their beltway. If MDOT proceeds with this plan, it won't stop at the current footprint. It would just be the start. As pressure would grow to extend the toll lanes through Montgomery and Prince George's counties. It would be the start of a costly and long-term expense for the state. I'd like to note that building toll lanes through a public-private partnership is not the answer. According to the Congressional Budget Office, about half of transportation P3s require government subsidies. In fact, according to recent remarks by Secretary Wiedefeld, before exiting the project, Transurban determined that it would need a larger financial settlement from the state, or financial investment from the state. We urge you to terminate this project and redirect those precious resources to worthy transportation needs in the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I'm Brian O'Malley with the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. I want to talk about, I guess, two topics. One is outcomes for folks. We've got some laudable state goals like leave no one behind. That's on the Welcome to Maryland signs. Like 60% climate pollution reductions by 2031. That was in the Climate Solutions Now Act that you all passed a couple of years ago. Like Vision Zero that Secretary Wiedefeld has spoken eloquently about. Unfortunately, our budget is not producing progress on those outcomes. In fact, our transportation budget continues to make those things worse. At the same time, we continue to pursue highway capacity projects in the name of traffic relief, and traffic continues to get worse. We're not actually providing traffic relief. And so I encourage you to use your oversight. I encourage MDOT to look more carefully at outcomes. We at the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance started a transportation report card in 2015, where we set a yardstick and then measure ourselves against that every 2 to 3 years. And the latest one, we get a D+ for the Central Maryland region, based on 12 grades for 12 indicators. We need to do better. And so I ask you to please look carefully at that. There's a lot of flexibility. Senator Rosapep talked about not just trying to find new revenue, but bending the cost curves was how he put it. I encourage, the legislature acted a few years ago to create Chapter 30, which gives MDOT a powerful tool to do what other states like Virginia are doing to make sure that taxpayer dollars go to those projects that produce the best outcomes. MDOT really hasn't used Chapter 30 anywhere near to its potential. And so I encourage you to follow up on that piece of legislation and ask them to do better. Look at the State Highway Administration minor projects. That's a $6 billion line item in a $20 billion 6-year program. It's huge, but there's very little scrutiny over how those dollars are spent. We know from the Federal Highway Administration that we could save between 25 and 85% if we limited expenditures to just resurfacing and reconstructing roadbeds, not widening while we're at it. But I think we do a lot of widening while we're at it. We just don't have a good handle on how much. So look more closely at that and find savings there. And lastly, the flexing of the federal dollars, which you asked about, Madam Chair. Thank you to MDOT for using FHWA formula funds to support things like transit, biking, and walking. They can support our highway projects, but they can also support other things. And we should be asking more questions and looking to do that even more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Josh Tolkien. I'm the director of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club. Thank you for hearing our testimony. I also sit on the Commission on Transportation Revenue and Infrastructure Needs. Many of our concerns have already been voiced today, so I'll try to focus on points that have not been made. First and foremost, we urge you to view the transportation budget not in a vacuum. It's interconnected to our climate goals, our housing goals, and our economic development goals. It requires a lot of interdependency. We're asking local government and other agencies to invest in a housing and climate strategy that reduces our greenhouse gas emissions, encourages local economic development, and provides opportunities to pull people out of poverty. Putting our budget in limbo for a year can cause significant problems with all of the different people who need to be combining for a united strategy. The $150 million rainy day fund does help mitigate some of the damages, but we urge the General Assembly to work with the governor to lean into and resolve as many of these problems this legislative session as possible. We do believe that there are revenue opportunities. The Sierra Club has endorsed proposals for adjusting toll rates, as well as implementing a fee on electric vehicles. It took us a long time to get there. We do urge that any fee on electric vehicles be paired with an increase in gasoline vehicles. You could bring in up to $45 million a year. There are some other bold proposals that were identified in the Train Commission's recommendations. Despite that, we also believe that this is a critical time for looking at prioritization. Long-term system preservation of MTA, of Metro is key. These are issues that can cause significant downstream costs. So we view this not about truly as an investment, that we're trying to prevent putting a future financial burden on Marylanders later on, trying to fix something that will be much more costly to fix rather than making sure upfront that it doesn't break. And that's why we are concerned about the decrease in funding in the outer years of the CTP. Sierra Club has recommendations on improving and strengthening the prioritization and scoring process to make sure that we're aligning the annual funding with Maryland's values. And we very much look forward to working with the General Assembly on both revenue and spending prioritization. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Okay, that ends our hearing on MDOT's overview. Next, we have similar topic, Maryland Department of Transportation Motor Vehicle Administration. And Carrie is back. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Carrie Cook to do the analysis for MDOT MVA. So beginning on page 1, the fiscal 2025 budget decreases by 7.2 million or 3.1%. This does not include the funding that was in the supplemental budget. So I will discuss that in just a few moments. And on page 2, the capital side, fiscal 2025 decreases 13 million or 37.3% to 21.8 million. Going into the managing for results, beginning on page 5. So this is just discussing MVA's customer service goals and how they are doing on those. So page 1 is alternative delivery service transactions as a percent of all transactions. So this is something that we look at every year. Again, this is the percent of transactions where folks can do it without having to go into a branch office. So MVA is continuing to improve on that metric. Exhibit 2 on page 6 is the average cost per MVA transaction. So you can see that that has gone down substantially in fiscal 2023. It's down to about $15.50. And I forgot to say this yesterday, but this is also not adjusted for inflation. So the fact that they are still going down with inflation is great. And obviously that spike there in 2020 just had to do with increased costs related to the pandemic. Exhibit 3 on page 7 is the average customer wait and visit times. Again, here from fiscal 2022 to 2023, you see a sharp decrease there. Average wait time is down to about 7.5 minutes in fiscal 2023, and it went down further in 2024 year to date. And there is also a new metric in this graph, which is that red line. That is percent of customers with a wait under 10 minutes. So in fiscal 2023, you saw that was 73%, which jumped substantially from the prior year. And in 2024 year to date, it has continued to increase. So definitely moving in the right direction there. Beginning to look at the fiscal 2025 budget, Exhibit 4 on page 8 shows you the overview. As is typical, the plurality is driver and vehicle services. So that's the funding for the branch offices. Exhibit 5 on page 9 is the proposed budget change chart. Again, this is prior to the supplemental funding. So personnel expenses decreased by a net 2.4 million. So we have the statewide salary actions, and those are offset by the personnel savings that were going to occur as the result of the proposed branch closures. They also have a proposed hiring freeze, and that was not restored in the supplemental budget. So we just asked them to discuss what that is going to entail. Continuing that same chart onto page 10, MVA continues to transition many of their transactions to virtual and just continue to push those efficiencies. So we have some costs associated with those software systems. And on the other side of the coin, we have a lot of savings associated with those efficiencies as well. Proposed operational reductions for MVA, again, before the supplemental, was a negative 6.2 million associated with rent from closing the offices and other contracts. And the supplemental budget, which includes that 150 million for MVA, that's about 4.4 million. And what that is doing for them is allowing them to maintain all of the hours at the branch offices. So no longer closing the 2 limited service branch offices, maintaining those Saturday and Thursday hours. So just, these numbers are before that supplemental was released. So just keep that in mind. Moving on to the personnel side on page 11, MVA had no changes in their number of positions. Their vacancy rate is about 7.2%. So that is just over their budgeted turnover rate, but still below the statewide average, which is hovering around 10%. Exhibit 6 on page 12 deals with the capital program for MVA. The total program is 95.9 million over the 6-year period. It is a pretty significant decrease from the previous year, and that's because they are finishing up their 2 major projects that they have. You can also see that major projects are not budgeted beyond fiscal 2025. So this is the last year that they're going to receive funding. And then page 13, Exhibit 7, just has details on those projects. The Customer Connect system, which is, again, that software efficiency system to help sort of streamline all those transactions, as well as the Glen Burnie headquarters renovation. This is the last year that those projects are getting funding in the CTP. They've been in there for a number of years. Moving on to the issues, beginning on page 14. The first is regarding the emissions program. So we talked about this last year, these proposed regulations, which do a number of things, but the sort of top line item is extending the exemption period for most new vehicles. So extending it from 3 years to when you need your first emissions test to 6 years. These were proposed in conjunction with MDE, and MVA knows that I think it's 99% of these vehicles do pass the emissions test. But there is a slight revenue impact in terms of MVA is collecting fewer of these test fees because fewer of the vehicles are required to go through those tests. So Exhibit 9 on page 16 shows you the net impact of these changes. So MVA had some assumptions in terms of how many folks typically use the kiosk test versus the tests at the centers. How many late fees are collected and things like that. And then there's also an slight expenditure reduction in terms of, since fewer cars are required to do these tests, they have to mail out fewer reminders to folks. So this is the net revenue impact of these changes. So in fiscal 2024, it's about minus 2.3 million because it wasn't the full fiscal year as it started in October. 2025 is the full fiscal year, and it's losing about 3.1 million in revenue from this change. Just to put it in perspective, the entire revenue for the emissions program fiscal 2025 is estimated about 37.7 million. So it's something, but it's not a lot relative to the entire program. So on page 17, we just asked the MVA discuss that a little bit further, given the challenges to the TTF that we heard about from Steve's presentation. The second issue, which I've already touched on, beginning on page 17, is just regarding that given the infusion from the governor's 150 million in general funds, MVA has avoided closing those two branch offices. Walnut Hill and Loch Raven Parkville were slated to permanently close, as well as elimination of Saturday hours at all branches and extended Thursday hours at all branches. So that supplemental budget included 2.4 million for MVA to support all those operations, keep those branches open for fiscal 2025 only, as well as supporting some additional IT needs. So just given that the initial proposal was to close the branches permanently, we ask MVA just to sort of discuss the long-term viability of keeping those branches open in terms of, you know, the one-time funding. One other thing I wanted to note that Steve mentioned in his presentation is the potential fee adjustments. So MDOT is assuming 40 million in increased fees for MVA beginning in fiscal 2025. They are in the regulatory hold right now, so it's something that they'll have to propose later on, but they can provide more details on that as well. Page 19, the recommendations is just to concur with the governor's allowance for both the operating and capital side. That concludes my presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Carrie. Any questions for our analyst? Okay. We have the director of the MVA, Ms. Christine Neiser, and Secretary Wiedefeld. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you again, Madam Chair, and for the record, Paul Wiedefeld, Secretary of Transportation. With me is Chrissy Neiser. You know, we're very fortunate to have Chrissy in the state of Maryland. She's one of the tops in the nation in running the motor vehicle. She's done a fantastic job on focusing on frontline employees to have some of the delivery things you just talked about, and to Senator Verzapep's issue earlier. She has been bending the cost curve, you know, through efficiencies, through technology over the years. So with that, I'll have her go through her budget and some of the issues that were raised. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary and Madam Chair and committee members. For the record, Chrissy Neiser, MVA Administrator. Pleasure to be with you again today, and thank Carrie for her analysis as always. As Secretary said, Customer Connect has really enabled us to move forward as an organization. We're now up to 60 transactions online through the My MVA account, and just really encourage everybody to sign up because of that 24/7 access to all of your MVA related information. We're also trying to meet our customers' needs in different ways. And one thing I'm really proud of that we've done recently is translate our law tests into plain language. That's the test you take to get a learner's permit. We completed that in November along with the manuals, and we've since then seen a 15% increase in the passage rate to the learner permit test. And that means people getting that learner's permit more quickly the first time and not having to come back with repeated trips. So we are looking at doing that other places, as well as we expanded the number of languages available to 17. In addition to that, just some updates in terms of issues I know that are important to the committee with CDL holders. We've talked about this in prior years. I'm glad to say we remain at 1 to 2 days for appointments for that skills test, so good accessibility there. And the legislature last year helped us pass a bill where their learner's permit is now 1 year in length, giving them more time to get through the process, and allowing existing CDL holders to use their medical certificate to renew online. And it's good to see the positive change that came from that. About 20% of our CDL holders were renewing electronically before. That number is now up to 52%. So legislation that changed really made a difference there. We talked earlier about highway safety, and I just want to reiterate that the Highway Safety Office is really here to partner with all the local jurisdictions. We are currently putting out a bid for opportunity for local highway safety grants that nonprofits and local governments can apply for. We stand ready to partner with everybody. Obviously, it's an unacceptable number where we are today, and we all need to work together to address that. With that, I'll address the specific comments and recommendations made by DLS. Starting with the first one in terms of the hiring freeze. It is important to say that the hiring freeze that we propose does not impact our customer agents and our driver's license agents. And obviously that's 70% of our employee base. So they are exempt from the hiring freeze. It really applies to our other positions, and we will review them going forward, case by case basis in terms of hiring. I will say, to the point the secretary made, we are already actively engaging our employees to find additional efficiencies. The more efficiencies we find in paperwork reduction and those kind of things, the less we have to do from a hiring freeze perspective. So that's how we're looking at it. I do also want to mention, because the senator's interest in what folks are doing in terms of innovative programs with employees, we are participating in the governor's new Department of Service and Civic Innovation. We've got 4 employees that were placed through that, 2 with our IT team and 2 in our branch offices. And we're really excited to be participating in that pilot program. The second question was related to the vehicle emissions modernization. And as was stated, we always partner with MDE. They're really the policy agency for where we go with this. With 99% of those vehicles passing, the decision was made to move forward with that implementation. And obviously there were some operational reductions on our side with less vehicles going through. So we currently are moving through that process and, educating customers about their new dates. In terms of the question on closing branch offices, obviously that's not a decision that we made lightly, but when you look at our budget, it really is people. There's not a lot of extra things in there. And so our goal when we had to come up with the reductions really was to protect our employees and to make sure we could still deliver excellent customer service. There is a process when branch office closed that they have to go through. It's a year-long process that the legislature deemed for all state agencies. So it would not be a process that would happen lightly. It would not be a process that would happen quickly. Even in the proposed reductions, they were not part of our early on reductions because of the acknowledgement of that process. We take very seriously, we serve everybody and not everybody has access to online services. And that's something we talk about all the time, whether it's our kiosks at the branches that provide it, even some computers that we offer at the branch offices, that's something that we will always hold as critical and important going forward. With that, we obviously concur with the recommendations on both the operating and capital side. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again, Mr. Secretary and Administrator Nizer. So I want to first start by saying, Mr. Secretary, I didn't say it earlier today. I do much appreciate, and this committee does, the response from your team whenever any of us or our constituents reach out, as it was the other day. So, but you guys have always been there for us in all of your shop. So I want to say that. Secondly, you talked about the local highway safety grants. Can you talk a little about your partners? Are you partnering with the community colleges that are in those locales? And if you could talk about that a little more and share with us, as again, we're in the overview stage, but we would certainly like to partner with you on that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And as follow-up, I'll provide some more information as well as a link to where they can go. These are really efforts with our law enforcement agencies, as well as some nonprofits who are doing public education, training out in the community. There are opportunities for messaging to get out about different highway safety programs. So there's a lot of great innovative things that are happening at the local level. And definitely I would love to get new partners involved if they're not already part of our network. So we will make sure that we provide that to everybody.
That'd be terrific from a awareness standpoint. And the last thing to say, again, as you said, it's terrific to have Ms. Nizer with you. So when I got appointed to the Senate, some of the things that delegates and senators get, you have the opportunity to have tags on your vehicle if you choose. Well, I was unique, or I'm not unique, but the position I was appointed to. You are unique. Let me correct this, right? So I was coming into the position for a senator, Senate President Miller position, but he didn't have a Senate 27 tag, and so I was looking at being on this long awaited list of trying to get a tag, but your office, had already had a plan in place just in case one day he woke up and he wanted to have that tag. So. It's the little things, Mr. Secretary, but I appreciate the efforts of MBA and you guys from an information standpoint. That communication is huge for the communities. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all the information. I do appreciate the kiosks and the places that you place them. It has made a difference in our community and it does make a difference overall. But and I see in some areas where we probably want to do maybe close some areas, or I would hope that we would help in every way to make sure that it doesn't hinder service.
Yes.
And that's, I think, our biggest concern, to make sure we do have availability and avenues where, you know, our constituents could have a place to continue to have maybe more kiosks or more avenues, just make sure they can get their service and get it well. And so it's something that I guess we can talk about a brainstorm to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. So,
No, and it's a
thank
great point, Senator. And just to reiterate, the reason we chose those branches is because we had capacity at other nearby branches. You're very familiar with the Essex branch, which
Yes.
recently expanded. We knew we had enough stations. We could take all the staff that were in Parkville, move them to Essex, still offering the same amount of appointments that we did previously and not impacting staff other than knowing they're not at the branch they used to be at. So, and the same thing with the branch in Montgomery County. There was a nearby branch in Gaithersburg, very large facility where we could accommodate all the appointments, all the customer agents who were currently employed there. That is why we chose those particular locations. We definitely want to keep that in consideration. And certainly you all would be part of any process if we did decide to move forward. But luckily with the current infusion, we're not there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Okay. Two follow-ups to that question. I'm sure you track data on what time of day, which days of the week are our highest visitors, people visit the most and different branches. I do think, to Senator Rosapep's earlier point about bending the cost curve, this is an opportunity to do it in a way that is really sensitive to not reducing services. But I think an opportunity, I mentioned the other day, you know, Saturdays and Thursday nights, really helpful for our constituents who are working 9 to 5. Where are you going? Can you go from here in terms of thinking creatively about ensuring we're being responsive to constituents, but perhaps bending that cost curve a little more?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So when we do have tons of data, which is a great thing, we look at it all the time. So Saturday is a very popular day. I'm just going to be honest. It was just to come up with the dollars. That's where we had to be. I will say Thursday night hasn't been taken advantage of as much as we would have liked to have seen. We implemented that maybe 4 years ago for the exact reason you said, people that are working and need to come later. I'm not sure if it's just a culture shift that people still don't know that we're open during those times. There are appointments available, but they tend not to be filled. And even when they are filled, people tend to come on the earlier side and not on the later side of the time frame. So those are things operationally I think we're always going to have to continue to evaluate and offer up changes as appropriate.
And I have actually not been in person in a long time because I utilize everything online. But have you thought about eliminating like a Monday in exchange for, because you have Saturdays?
Yeah, we've thought about different options there in terms of what a schedule looks. What we have seen when we've made at least temporary changes where we've done like all day Saturday service, it takes a while for the public to adjust to what they know our traditional hours are. So we wind up spending a lot of manpower for not a lot of return in terms of the number of transactions. So that's always a balance in terms of how much do you innovate while not also confusing the public with differing messages. I've also thought about different branches depending on volume. Do you change hours just there? But again, that's that messaging piece of how do you make sure customers truly understand where they can go and get the service they need.
If you haven't done so already, a public survey, or perhaps some type of way to solicit input would be helpful as well.
And that's actually how we increased the Thursday night. We went out and did a public survey and that was, you know, some of the feedback we received. But yeah, happy to go back out and just try to get another sense of where the public is at this point.
I think I know what Senator Rosepep's question is.
Let's see if you do. Go for it, Madam Chair.
You sent an email a couple months ago about the perhaps overuse of historic tags to skirt some regulations and wanted to follow up on that.
That is not what I was going to ask.
I do have some information.
I had already
on that,
teed it
though,
up for
if
you.
you'd like.
Too, yes.
Go with that.
Certainly. Well, as you know, there is a historic vehicle requirement, 20 years age and older. It exempts from both vehicle emissions as well as the inspection requirements. We do track the numbers because there have been bills in the legislature over the last several years. I think most recently 2016, where there's some tweaks to the requirements, but the number of historic vehicles continues to grow. And I'll just give you some examples and I'm happy to provide the follow-up data in writing. But in 2019, November, we were about 137,000 historic vehicles. As of today, we're up to about 178,000. So the number is continuing to grow, not astronomically, but there is definitely growth there. And obviously understand the concern in terms of lost revenue, but also potentially safety issues that have been, brought up to our attention and other things that people may be looking to avoid. Under the current statute, there's really not much more we could do. It would require, I think, a statutory change by the legislature, whether that's establishing a year prior to which the vehicles would qualify or some other requirement. I know in the past there's been discussion about should there be an historic insurance requirement. There is historic insurance that generally is a little more expensive. So obviously pros and cons there. So there's ways to do it. It just really depends where the legislature wants to go from a policy standpoint. I think it's hard for law enforcement to enforce, and I'm sure you're aware of that because of the repeated use. They have to witness that individual driving to work, for example, multiple times in order to cite them. They can cite them, but it's difficult.
I would suggest in 2024, a car that's 2003 is not a historic vehicle. So I would encourage us to maybe go back to the drawing board on that one. Thank you.
I agree. I mean, I think that's the concept I'm trying to get. So, I mean, we'd have to change the law. Okay. But if you guys gave us some ideas about something you think would be practical, I think that would be really, really helpful. We're not asking you to make the value judgment, but give us some options or something. That'd be great.
We'll provide information.
Now my other question. I wish I now have forgotten my questions. Tell you the honest to God truth.
Madam Chair,
Why don't you let him? Yeah, why don't you do that?
While he's trying to retrieve this question, I'm sorry. Back to the historical tax piece. So, for those of us who have like 60 series vehicles, we get a little upset when we see vehicles in the 80s. We're talking that acting as if they're historic vehicles. I just want to put that on record. So. Oh, absolutely. I know. Are you good? Yeah.
I'm here. I'm back. Yeah, thank you. Maybe you do this already, but this issue about smoothing out when customers come to show up and when you have to staff it. You want to do it to ways that save money, so you're providing the service without have people sitting there and not serve. Have you looked at or done anything to share some of the savings with the folks who are coming in? I mean, charge, people love discounts and people will go a long way to save $10. Have you thought about actually doing some price variation to encourage people to go when it's most efficient to be able to serve them?
So the appointment process has really allowed us to create great efficiencies. The challenges we had before when we had part appointments and part walk-ins is you would see those extreme spikes in volumes in the beginning of the day, around the middle of the day, and the end of the day. With appointments, when we started out initially, we had them spread out evenly throughout the day, and we quickly realized we needed to adjust that to exactly your point, to be more efficient. We had lunches, we had breaks, we had other things that we had to account for. So we've made a lot of our day is variable to address exactly those issues. We've never done changes in fee structure.
That's what I'm raising.
I will say our fees have not been adjusted, many of them in over 20 years, and we have continued to with alternative services. We're mailing a lot of our products. The cost of mailing has gone up, I think, 5 times in the last 2.5 years. It is increasingly expensive and to be able to get products to people. But at the same time, we want to encourage them to do things outside the branch office. So it's always a balance for us in order to continue to encourage folks to do things conveniently, but then also having to get those products to them.
I get that. So a lot of your fees haven't been updated in 20 years?
Many of them have.
That's like new information.
Yeah, that's why we proposed the fee increases.
Oh, these are the ones you proposed.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to ones you hadn't proposed.
No.
I'm sorry.
That's what we're trying to bring
Yeah,
it
no.
up
Now I'm putting it together. But I'm coming back to the question of, you talked about some people when you had evening hours that they come in early, they don't come in late, or there's some days.
So even with our appointment process, what we find is that customers still come in early. And I think part of this is a culture change. They still remember the MBA the way it used to be.
No, I get that, but I'm going to push this point.
Yeah.
I mean, what if you gave people $10 off if they came late? To try to smooth it out. That's what I'm saying. If it saves us, if you share a little bit of the savings with the customer, it incentivizes the customer. If they got a choice between coming at this time or that time and they save $10, I'd ask you to think about that.
Sure. No, we will. I mean, but it's got to save.
No, I agree, but that's a modeling issue.
No, I understand.
But I will say this only because I have some relatives who are very, very discount conscious.
Okay.
You all may have some relatives like that too. Seriously, they will go to enormous lengths to save $5. And so look, it's the psychology of it. And so I would ask you to think about that, because in any customer service related thing, we don't do that much in government. We don't give people much of a reward financially for doing something that makes it more efficient. We pocket the savings. We don't share any of the savings with them. If you share some of the savings with them, then we're all ahead. So I ask you to think about it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Been thinking about this joke for the last 5 minutes. We're gonna shift gears to Department of Agriculture. I couldn't help it. It was just too easy. So Department of Agriculture, and we have our friend Andrew Gray here to give us the analysis.
Madam Chair, I'll just say that's corny. So this is Andrew Gray, Department of Agriculture, looking at the fiscal 2025 allowance. On page 1 of the analysis, you see the operating budget decreases by $9.6 million or 7% to $127.7 million in fiscal 2025. Moving now to the page 2, we'll get right into the fiscal 2024 implementation of legislative priorities. So there's Marbidco funding substitution. So $6 million was added to Marbidco's core loan programs. And that was funding that was originally for the Next Generation Farmland Acquisition Program. But with the understanding there's a high interest rate environment, the idea was to shift that money to the $6 million for their core loans. They're going to be spending approximately $3 million by the end of January. That was the estimate, and between $600,000 and $1 million each month for the remainder of fiscal 2024, looking at around $8 million in overall spending for fiscal 2025. The Maryland Agricultural Fair Board was provided an additional $1,075,000 in general funds. That funding was primarily used for the fair shows, and there was also money left over that was used for the Great Frederick Fair payments. On page 3, the Spay Neuter Fund, $200,000 in general funds were provided for this program. Because of the reduction in the amount of revenues coming in, this largely replaced the money that had been lost. And so therefore, there wasn't a really large increase in the amount of work that's done by the Spay Neuter program. Just note that there is legislation in this session to increase the fee for the Spay Neuter Fund revenues. Rural Maryland Council received $300,000 in general funds. That funding was primarily used for its rural health work. There was also funding that was provided to their Maryland Agricultural Education and Rural Development Assistance Fund for kind of youth engagement and leadership development. And then finally, the Southern Maryland Agricultural Development Commission was provided $100,000 in general funds. That funding has not actually been utilized yet. The paperwork will still need to be completed, as the last time I kind of checked in. And that will be used for an economic development plan for the space at the Lothian Grain Elevator. All right, looking at the deficiencies for fiscal 2024, you have the first kind of line there down on page 3 is filling vacancies. The Maryland Department of Agriculture has been absolutely stellar in terms of reducing its vacancy rate. And in order to do this, it had to, in a sense, kind of move forward and not really be, kind of worry about turnover as much. As a result of that, they've been able to fill a tremendous number of positions, but then they need funding in fiscal 24 to then backfill because they're now not able to meet turnover. So there's $781,288 provided in general funds for personnel expenditures to kind of alleviate that stress now that they've done their fantastic job of filling all those positions. In terms of the Frederick and Salisbury Animal Health Laboratory maintenance funding, there's $322,000 in 2 programs for the maintenance funding at the Salisbury Health Lab. My understanding is that there's maintenance costs have definitely gone up for those labs. The Salisbury one was the one that was recently built. And the mosquito control on page 4 is an increase of $100,000 to fund reclassifications in that particular program. Just a brief note about this federal stimulus money, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Inflation Reduction Act funding. Previously, the Maryland Department of Budget and Management did provide some information about funding that was requested, or there was the Maryland Department of Agriculture was pursuing, but that funding is actually going to go through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So it's actually not going to flow through the Maryland Department of Agriculture's budget. The Maryland Department of Agriculture will assist with technical assistance, but it's not the money coming through their particular budget in terms of the stimulus funding. In terms of the overall agency spending in Exhibit 1, this is on page 5. Office of Resource Conservation is around almost half the agency's budget, largely $25.5 million for the cover crop program. Then there's around $18.7 million for salaries there. The Office of Marketing, Animal Industries and Consumer Services around 30%. Largely salaries, $11.2 million. There's also funding here for the Rural Maryland Council, $8.4 million in fiscal 2025, and $4.1 million from our BIDCO as well. That's kind of Maryland Agricultural Resource-Based Industry Development Corporation. In terms of the Office of Plant Industries and Pest Management, $17.1 million. Mostly salaries, $9.6 million, and there's also $2.2 million for contracts and state chemist, gypsy moth suppression, and other purposes. The Office of the Secretary is 9.7% of the overall budget in fiscal 25, provides administrative support services, and largely the funding there is for salaries, and then also for the Department of Information Technology Services allocation. Exhibit 2 on page 7 is the proposed budget, $1.8 million, well, it's 7% decrease, $9.6 million between fiscal 24 and 25. This is the adjusted amounts based on kind of adjusting for some of the salary components that are not in the budget. The salary increases by $1.8 million between fiscal 24 and 2025. The funding, once again, is not included for the fiscal some of the fiscal 2024 funding, so therefore it's a larger increase than we would otherwise see. Costs associated with 17 new positions around $1.2 million. There's around $915,000 due to the turnover rate decreasing. So a lower rate means that there's less money being taken out of the budget, around $915,000 reflected there. In terms of agricultural policy, the big funding increase is $2 million for the Women, Infants, and Children Farmers Market Nutrition Program. This is largely work that's being done on a federal grant provided in fiscal 23 for 3 years. And it was funding for working with the food banks in order to kind of, you provide money to the food banks to buy from local farmers to then provide to people in need. It's good, healthy food. The nuisance insects sees a $275,000 increase, $137,500 in special funds, and the same amount in general funds for black fly and midge treatment program work. We'll have a recommendation about that. And then going down to the one-time legislative and other funding, a couple of decreases here due to the contingent reduction for the Maryland Native Plants Program in the governor's fiscal 2025 budget. So there's a mandated funding for that particular program. We'll discuss that more in a second. Then there's the one-time funding that we talked about in terms of those deficiencies for Southern Maryland Agricultural Development Commission, Spay and Neuter, and the Rural Maryland Council. Then on page 8, it's around 1 million, well, somewhat large decreases here, largely connected to Maryland Agricultural Resource-Based Industry Development Corporation. You're seeing the $10 million for the core loan program and Next Generation Farmland combined. And then you're also seeing some decreases there for the MDA Modernization Information Technology Project, and we'll talk a little bit more about that one as well. All right, moving now to the kind of recommended actions on page 9 with the embedded within the analysis. DLS is recommending the reduction of funding for the nuisance insects program. There is funding available for the through the consent decree from Back River and Patapsco for addressing the midge in the Patapsco River watershed. The agency does note, though, that there are a lot of other needs for the funding that outstrip the amount that's actually budgeted here. So just kind of put that out there. The other component that DLS would kind of comment on page 11, talking about the Maryland Native Plants Program. So the money is budgeted there, the $100,000 for the program, and the agency has actually already hired the person to do the work that's necessary. However, as a result of that reduction, my understanding is the program would not be funded in terms of the personnel to do that work. Therefore, DLS recommends the budget committees consider whether they want to maintain the mandated funding by rejecting that BRFA and contingent cut, or restrict funding in MDA's budget for the purposes of this particular program. On personnel data on page 12, this is highlights the reduction in the vacancy rate. Substantial decrease from last year, and also just looking great in terms of the state overall. MDA's regular positions increased by 17 between fiscal 24 and 25. DLS does have a recommendation here concerning those positions because it does not appear that all the positions were at the 25% turnover rate. So when you have a new position, the assumption is that you're probably not going to hire the person before October or so. And therefore, you increase the turnover to 25% because that's a quarter of the year that you're not going to actually have that person there. Well, I will note, though, that we were not aware that there are 4 contractual conversions. So these are positions that are actually contractual FTEs right now that would just shift over to regular positions. So that changes these numbers, as well as the fact that the state value-added agricultural specialist has already been hired as well, and therefore would not be appropriate to increase turnover on that individual. So these numbers will be modified, kind of looking through the decision period. Moving on to the key observations on page 15. The first one concerns the weights and measures program. So there is legislation in this session for licensing, registration fees, penalties, and regulation changes, kind of gamut for the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and similarly for other agencies as well. Does a lot of substantial work here. One of the major components is for the weights and measures program, which is to provide for the Secretary of Agriculture to set reasonable fees that are level to produce funds to approximate the costs of registering each weight and measure used for commercial purposes. So this sounded like it was money might be included in the budget. We saw a big increase in special funds in the budget, which would comport with that idea that the fee was actually included, but it's not. What's actually happening is that the Maryland Department of Agriculture is using balance to provide for a large increase in its special funds to around $2.6, almost $7 million, $2.7 million in fiscal 2025. And that information was not available to us, unfortunately, at the time we made the recommendation, which is to reduce the general funds. The idea being here that if they have such a large special fund increase, and they're potentially going to also see fee revenues as well, then it seems like you could take a general fund reduction. But the agency notes that they're using balance to address this special fund increase, and they're also concerned that they're not going to be able to bring on those fee revenues until at least fiscal 2026 due to the constraints of putting in the legislation, passing the regulations, and also the portal that opens for the registration of those devices. The recommendation, or issue number 2, or observation number 2, is on page 16. This is enforcement and inspection, position strength assessment, and vacant position filling. So this is narrative that's been language has been included for a couple of years now in the analyses for the Maryland Department of Agriculture and the Maryland Department of the Environment. And just a couple of notes here in terms of there's been some decreases in the numbers in terms of the number of inspections that are done for agricultural nutrient management and for certified consultant reviews. Now, it doesn't seem to be substantial at this point. The Department of Legislative Services noted that this information came in. It was supposed to be done quarterly, but then the budget committees agreed that one report in April would be sufficient. But before that happened, the agency submitted the July information, which you're seeing here. DLS recommends that instead of the quarterly reporting for next year, why not just have one report provided by January 1, 2025 to have all the information available to the legislators, to you guys, right before session. Recommendation or key observation number 3 on page 17 concerns the Maryland Agricultural and Resource-Based Industry Development Corporation, or MARBIDCO. So MARBIDCO was formed back in 2004 by Chapter 467, just before the Major Agricultural Stewardship Act of 2006. Basic idea is to be self-sustaining by fiscal 2026. Therefore, the funding that's been provided by the state over the years would then revolve through their loan programs with some loss through grants, but a minor amount, which would then enable MARBIDCO to continue its work without any new state funding. So the question is that going to actually happen? So MARBIDCO has done a couple of models, and long and short of it is that MARBIDCO is going to be self-sustaining, but it will not be in-year self-sustaining until around 2030 or so. And what that means is that they're not going to be able to put out enough loans in fiscal 2004 and 5 to revolve to be able to then get the principal and interest payments to be self-sustaining for loan purposes. But they will have balance to be able to address those loans. So they'll be able to do around $6 million in loans each year because they have a balance that they're going to be able to work from. And then by around 2030 or so, they hope to be self-sustaining moving forward. So some of the questions regarding this, though, the board of directors from MARBIDCO has made the point of increasing the overall portfolio for the loans interest rate to 4%, which may discourage some interest in the kind of the program. And there's also just the question about the operating expenses relative to revenues, which average between like 31% in fiscal 24, but do decrease a little bit to around 25% in fiscal 23, but still seem a little high. So Department of Legislative Services recommends that MDA comment on the high ratio of its operating income to or operating expenses to revenues. In addition, DLS recommends that MDA comments on whether the goal of self-sustaining will actually be met. And finally, to comment on the demand impact of that 4% interest rate for its overall portfolio. That was a rate that was right before the pandemic, and they lowered their rates for the pandemic. What does that mean going forward if they were to raise them again? On page 19 is key observation number 4. This concerns value-added agriculture in Maryland. The question is, where do we want to be? We have a viable, vibrant, value-added agricultural industry or kind of businesses in Maryland, but we don't really measure it. So we now have a state specialist for value-added agriculture. And the question is, can that information be provided in terms of where we are and where we want to go? DLS recommends that MDA develop managing for results, input, output, and outcome measures that kind of look at the overall goal for where we want to be in terms of value-added agriculture businesses in Maryland each year. Also recommends that MDA submit a report on value-added agriculture with a number of components listed here on the bottom of page 19 and then on to page 20. Page 20 is the 5th key observation. This is the highly pathogenic avian influenza. I don't want to belabor the point here. We did have an outbreak in November 30th, 2023 in Caroline County, so relatively recently. So obviously this is still a going concern. Federal money and state money is obviously providing for addressing the concerns here. And it sounds like there is no real overall kind of silver bullet for addressing this issue. DLS does recommend MDA comment on whether they have seen a general pattern, whether greater regulatory authority or staffing capacity is needed to address those outbreaks, whether a cooperative funding approach with the poultry companies would be advantageous to address those outbreaks as well. And finally, whether there is any kind of co-benefits between highly pathogenic avian influenza reduction and the other policy areas such as Chesapeake Bay restoration, climate change, and air quality. Finally, the 6th and final key observation on page 21 is the 2023 Farm Bill. Congress has basically punted on this with continuing resolutions, so they kind of pushed it out. It's not clear when they're going to actually take it up. A lot of potential opportunities there for changing the constraints on how federal programs are used, and that might make them more interesting and viable to Maryland farmers. DLS recommends the MDA comment what those constraints are currently and how that farm bill might be able to kind of change those constraints in order to be able to use more of that federal funding. And moving now to the recommended actions on page 22. This first recommended action is the turnover cut, which will be adjusted to account for the 4 positions that have been now contractual conversions and the 1 position, the state value-added agricultural position that's been filled. The second recommendation is for the weights and measures program will be calibrated as well to accommodate the fact that their special funds are from balance and that there does not appear to be a general fund excess for this particular purpose. And finally, or the third recommendation is for that narrative on the state and future of value-added agriculture in Maryland on page 22. And then on page 23, finally, is that recommendation for the nuisance insects blackfly and midge treatment program reduction. So kind of could be a policy decision about whether that's sufficient funding to really do all the work that's necessary, especially since the consent decree will address the midges in the Back River watershed. That's there any, well, actually there's one final thing. The on appendix 3 on page 27, this is the MDA digitization and modernization project. I'll just highlight there in the table that the overall project is funded currently in the Department of Information Technology's budget. So you're not seeing it here. So it's around $1 million in fiscal 25. The overall project cost does rise around $60.4 million to address moving MDA's programs into the one-stop platform, kind of bring them to the digital kind of age in terms of flexibility and use. A number of programs will be going in that particular direction. Just once again, highlighting that's quite a bit of money, $60.4 million over the entire time period of that project. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. And I skipped my appendices, which was a mistake, because that is a pretty alarming number. And I know you and I are not IT experts, but can you speak to possibly how 60 million to on board?
Well, I mean, certainly a number of programs are going to be addressed. I think the information technology project request did specify kind of how much there was cost-wise for each of these. I'll have to go back and check, but it kind of ramps up, obviously. You can certainly see how did things work in fiscal 2025 and then recalibrate for fiscal 26. Did it work well? Are the programs actually coming online the way we're expecting, or are there major problems that we need to rethink the whole operation?
Okay, other questions for Andrew? Okay, Mr. Secretary and whoever from your team. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Chair Elfrith and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you. I would love to first start with that number sounds really off. The $60 million. If we had $60 million, we could fix everything, and we are by no means have any aspirations of fixing everything. So we'll need to double check on that just to see what that is. But I did want to thank you very much for the opportunity. We have a budget before us that reflects not only MDA's mission to provide leadership in the industry, but one that supports agriculture. And at the end of the day, and I said this last week, we are in the business of supporting and promoting agriculture. It reflects the core values of the Moore-Miller administration, and it will help us turn Maryland into one of the greenest states around. Some other things that it does, it expands agricultural programs that improve soil health, which is important not only for the environment, but as I mentioned before, the profitability of our farming industry. It will preserve agricultural land. It will provide fresh and local food to all Marylanders, which helps on all of the points on poverty and feeding kids in schools, and it will restore our treasured Chesapeake. As you know, agriculture is the #1 commercial industry in the state. Some stats, 350,000 people work in agriculture and touch agriculture in some capacity. There are 6,000 full-time farmers across the state, contributing billions in economic activity to the state annually. We have 2 million acres of land in agriculture. Roughly 32% of all land in the state is being farmed in some capacity. We do have an immense appreciation for the challenges facing this committee related to budget. I will say that what you have before you is a fiscally responsible budget for an agency in the state. Just a quick overview. General funds, $52 million, special funds, $37.9 million, federal funds, which we are hoping to leverage much more of. We are hiring a grant specialist to go after money that USDA and EPA have related to some of our programs and priorities. $10 million in federal funds currently, and reimbursable funds, $25.5 million. With respect to the PINs, we do have 17 new PINs. I wish it was 70 new PINs. It's 17 new PINs. 4 of these, as Mr. Gray mentioned, were contractual conversions. 13 are needed to fulfill legislative mandates and also backfill positions that are very much in need. We are, I think, still the reigning champion with our vacancy rate, and I'll have Mr. Gray confirm that at 6.33%. We have every intention of keeping it that way. As you could imagine, filling positions helps the department work and run better. And so we've had a goal on that. When a position comes open, it is a race with a very small HR staff to get these positions posted and get folks in. To some of the other points, vehicles. So yes, there are some inspection vans and vehicles and some pickup trucks as we need for our field staff. But weights and measures, for example, their trucks are specialized. One of their trucks, which helps to measure the road scales that we measure all commerce coming through the state, that one truck is a $400,000 expense, and they need to be replaced. We've been holding off on them, and delays are, the delay in purchasing is causing pretty big expenses in terms of fixing and repairs. We're also receiving approximately $665,000 for additional equipment to replace existing and out-of-date equipment in some of our other labs. Again, in weights and measures, which just as a reminder is a public and consumer safety division. We have electrical vehicle charging that we need to start regulating and inspecting. Right now, we're regulating and inspecting every gas station, but if you're an electric vehicle owner, you're not really sure. There's no one out there regulating the amount that you're charging and how fast and that it's meeting the manufacturer's needs. We have no equipment currently, so we're exploring and investigating that. State chemist, as another example, state chemist approves all fertilizers, all pesticides, many other things that come in. We're reviewing pet foods and other things that are registered in the state. Very, very specialized equipment. Would love to have you come to our headquarters and tour our labs so that you can see actual real science happening there. Our equipment is being put on limited service in halftime because it is 10, 15, 20 years past replacement. And so there is a point in time, and we've reached that time where we will need to replace these. The cost of replacing our formulation system, for example, is approximately $94,000. So this is not your high school lab set. This is big time commercial equipment. As you'll see in the analysis, one of the key differences in the budget before you is a little bit less funding in general funding for Marbidco. In 24, they received a one-time increase of 11 million for their core loan programs and 6 million for next generation, et cetera. The decrease in funding will, from our analysis, not harm Marbidco. It's a cut, and there will be folks who will not be able to apply for and receive grants that are super helpful. Marbidco, again, is part of that. We're in the business of promoting agriculture. And so a startup or someone who's expanding may have few opportunities through traditional banking to receive loans and grants. But Marbidco is a place where so many have been helped and are able to expand. That is a very high level overview of our budget. I did want to say that while this proposed budget does not resolve all of our fiscal challenges, and as you could imagine, being a smaller agency and for many, many years being required to cut, one of the challenges is when we are asked to cut, it's programs. And so then you don't have a state chemist, or you don't have mosquito control, or you don't have food quality assurance and protection, or you don't have animal health. And so so many of these are related, as we heard, with high path avian influenza and other, the mosquito outbreaks, some of the diseases. This is about human health. So with that, thank you very much. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Salling.
Hey, thank you. I got a promotion. That's okay. I appreciate it. No, I'm sorry. I have a quick question. This is a statement, and I have to go meet with the chair of our committee. But we talked briefly, and you know my concern. We have done and come a long way with the problems that we have with our midges, and I think we've come a long way with our black fly. And I believe we need to continue to move forward with our matching funds we have with our county. Just knowing that we have people that are working with us, and we have the equipment that's being literally given to us voluntarily, and we literally have a plane for free that is working with us to do the application. And moving away from this or taking these funds away is really going to be detrimental. And we always say this is a nuisance fly or midge, but it is a health problem with those that have asthma, and we found that out also. So just knowing it's a health problem and a nuisance, I think we got to find a way to try to work this out. And I'm more than willing to sit down with the secretary to see what more we can do to not stop this, these funds, but find ways to work with you and partner with you and try to achieve this to make a difference. Because again, we have come a long way. We have made a difference. And I want to continue to move forward so we don't have this problem working at the treatment plant and around the area. So I would love that opportunity to try to move forward with this, sir.
I appreciate that. And you'll see that we did request that the funds remain in the budget. Black flies and midges, two very different things. And I think when you are receiving the calls and letters and emails that we are, nuisance is not the appropriate word. It is life and activity changing for the folks who are in the kind of red zones here, Back River, and then certainly out in Western Maryland. When you get along the Potomac, we're seeing pictures of folks who, tried to go garden and they're just covered in bites and, have scars and bruises. And we've gone a year without concerted treatment, and we need to get back into the business of supporting our counties. And again, it's a match. So we're not funding this. Assistant Secretary Mike Calkins is here, and he can tell you that he's been on the phone with Washington County, Frederick County, Baltimore County, not the political class, but the folks who are out there helping to manage these programs. And a little bit of state money will go a very long way because of the matching that comes in. So thank you for that.
I thank you, and I thank you for our Madam Chair for that. And I'm sorry I have to go. I have to meet with our chairman, but thank you so much for the information. We'll work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. It's our analyst job to give us all the options, and I appreciate that, whether we take them or not. That's our decision. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Just a quick question. Partnerships, high schools, community colleges, university system. I know, you get into the tight squeeze. I'm become very fond of the environmental sciences programs through the local school systems. I sort of stumbled upon, a very, very dynamic group of folks at Gwynn Park High School, one of the, if not the largest FFA programs in the state. And it kind of took me back, to know that only in a county like Prince George's County is only 3 programs, 27 high schools, only 3 programs. And look at what Prince George's County is made up, and look at what the environmental sciences offer. So from a promotional standpoint, we're having a conversation with our school system. How do we promote that for your future interns, your future employees, but also folks who can help share ideas about how to get things done. From a state funding and matching standpoint, I know your equipment is unique and your needs are unique, but are the universities a part of the innovation in your next day technologies moving forward? And is there some way that you all could possibly work on reducing costs, or at least bridging a gap to ensure that you have the proper equipment, because your service is so vital. So that's it.
Senator, thank you for the question. Two things. Just first, I want to answer or address your first point initially, and that is about FFA and the idea, and I would add 4-H into that as well. The idea of introducing agriculture in some capacity to a school-age child into middle school, and then certainly at high school, where we're thinking about career and technical elements of the future. It makes such a difference. When you look at the Farm Bureau, for example, all of their new hires went through the FFA program. They got to know their new hires when they were in high school, and immediately, and you're seeing them in your offices, I'm sure, they are products of FFA, and they're going to work not only in institutions of higher ed, getting their not just undergrads, but follow through to their masters and PhDs. If you check with anyone in the University of Maryland Ag program, many of them, most of them have been through the FFA program. And so I often say, if we had FFA programs in Baltimore City high schools, in Bladensburg, in places where, in my hometown of Bowie, we did not have an FFA program. But if we did, we would be connecting the dots between the food we're eating and the people that are growing them, and seeing that it's an actual viable career. To partnerships, we have great partnerships with the University of Maryland, College Park, and also UMES on the Eastern Shore. I'll just use weights and measures and our metrology lab. It's one of the few labs of its kind in the country. And so we have very, very high tech and very specialized equipment that in many cases the universities have a small mini version, but they don't have the level that we do. And I would say that is also one of the reasons why we have challenges with staff and retaining staff is that we are one of 6. We train them up and they go work for NIST or someone else right nearby for a lot more money, which, you know, that can be a challenge. But yes, we're always looking for opportunities and if there are ways to cost share, if there are ways to collaborate, we try to do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We've talked about apprenticeships in the past in agriculture, and 2 thoughts come to mind. One is, are you aware of or plugged into the new career counseling system that's been set up under the blueprint that's launched this year across the state?
We are, the Department of Ag is not directly.
Okay. Now you are.
Okay. Thank you, Senator.
There's a lot of money, seriously, that the blueprint has put in starting this year to career counselors to go into all the middle schools to give the broad view of what are possible careers, and then to do individual career counseling in 9th and 10th grade for kids to decide what path they want to go for in the 11th and 12th grade, including the high school level of registered apprenticeships. So the agriculture department is perfectly positioned, along with the Farm Bureau and other people, to be the technical assistants and the show and tell for these career counselors. They don't know about agriculture, like lots of people don't know about agriculture, but I would get with the probably the CTE office at MSDE and say,
who we've had meetings with.
Yeah, how can you plug in to make sure they all are doing agriculture careers?
So I might have spoken too soon. So we have our influence in there. We're not directly involved in the ongoing discussions, but the Maryland Ag Education Foundation and other groups of that nature that are focused on specifically on, and FFA focus specifically on ag education and the career side of it. They are working on CTE programs and making sure that we're integrated. But we've had a number of conversations with Department of Ed, and we'll continue those.
Okay, but I mean, this is a little different than CTE. This is career counseling without regard to the classes. And so it's familiarization, and then what are the opportunities, and then plugging agricultural employers. So it actually makes that's number one. Number two is the Department of Labor and the local workforce boards have millions of dollars right now available for startups of group apprenticeship programs across industries. And so if you and your partners can identify trade associations or other groups, and I'm sure that you know all the trade associations in agriculture, there's money for them to create startups for group apprenticeship programs in their industry. So again, there's the Department of Labor that would you got to talk to and see about how you could plug agriculture into it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for both of those.
Thank you, Senator. Okay, we have had a conversation about invasive plants and native plants. I know how seriously you and your team take it. So I was a little bit troubled by the Bertha action on native plants. I read your testimony. I appreciate the position that you're in. Can you speak a little bit more? Andrew mentioned that you have hired somebody, have someone in the pipeline, contracted with somebody for the native plant position. Can you speak a little more towards that?
So it is not, as with many things in Department of Ag, we are resource tight. We have an individual who has been assigned this project.
Okay.
But it was anticipating funding.
Okay.
And we also look at how we're going to be promoting native plants. We have a larger Maryland's Best promotion program, and we're reworking that to figure out where, in addition to food and agritourism and all of the other things, we can plug in native plants into that.
Okay.
And that is that individual's responsibility.
Okay. And we have talked before about again, an inherited challenge you received when you got here, not having funding to implement the invasive plant law that we passed in 21. So seeing that is not reflected in this budget either, but a rhetorical question. I'm trying to phrase it in a question. It's a priority for this subcommittee And I know it's a priority for Department of Agriculture, so I'd like to work with you on figuring that one out. Isn't that so?
Us too, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very
And I
much.
think I responded with natives instead of invasives. But we're looking at all of these.
Yep.
Yeah, because they're all equally important.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you to your team. And we have two other witnesses, Steve McHenry from our BidCo and our friend Ms. Charlotte Davis from the Rural Maryland Council.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Steve McHenry, BidCo Executive Director. It's great to be before you all again. Thank you very much. I also want to commend Mr. Gray for a very thorough analysis as always. You should have received my testimony statement electronically. It's a little longer, provided 6.5 pages of background before responding directly to the DLS questions. But just very briefly, last year was a record year for BidCo. We funded 128 projects totaling $14.1 million. In the core loan category, which is the topic of a lot of the focus of the analysis this year, we made $9 million in core program loans, principally through our Maryland Resource-Based Industry Financing Fund program. We affectionately call it the Mr. BIF program. We love our acronyms at BidCo. That is our workhorse program. That is the program that's getting us to self-sustainability in the future. Mr. Gray mentioned the Ag Stewardship Act of 2006. It was a landmark piece of legislation, and it set BidCo on the path that we are on today. Fiscal 2025 is a landmark year for BidCo because our funding ends in two mandated programs: an aggregation grant program, a priority of Senator Hester. We think we're going to be good as far as we can know going forward, and more importantly, the core programs funding is ending because we have accumulated enough resources through lending through the years, plus a fund balance, as Mr. Gray noted, that we will indeed be self-sustaining for many years to come. Does that mean in perpetuity? I can't tell you that, but we're projecting through 2030 to be able to do what we think is an average amount of lending each year in our core programs at $6 million. We did $9 million in the last 2 years, but averaging out the last 8, $6.1 million seems like a good number. So we're going with that. In my response, beginning on page 7, I did speak to Mr. Gray's questions. Additionally, he spoke about the effects of inflation. Yes, inflation has definitely increased our operating costs, our personnel costs, costs for goods and services. But again, we think we're dealing with that successfully. He mentioned our average loan portfolio interest rate. We can capture a snapshot in time what the average rate, weighted rate is across all of our loans in our portfolio. And right before the pandemic, the average rate was 4.25%, which is above our target. During the pandemic, we lowered the interest rates in 129 Mr. BIF loans because we wanted to help our customers. And the market rates were very low at that time, below 5%. They're more like they've been as high as 9 for commercial loans. They're about 8.25 to 8.5 today for commercial loans, not residential real estate loans, which are a little lower. And so our Mr. BIF loan rate today is 4.75. Obviously, there's great demand for that program because you take the BidCo funding and match it up with the funding from the bank or the Farm Credit Association. You get a blended cost of capital, which is less than what the market rate would be today. So it helps with affordability to help those farmers buy their first farms or do whatever it is they're doing in seeking commercial lending financing. I provided some projections on the self-sustainability question, and I think we're good to go for the next several years. We appreciate this committee's support, and with respect to the Next Generation program, that's the program that helps beginning farmers buy their first farms in exchange for extinguishing development rights immediately or down the road. We do have sufficient funding for, we think, the next 2.5 to 3 years, but by fiscal 27, we're going to need an infusion in that particular program. So thank you again for your support. I appreciate everything.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Charlotte Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Rural Maryland Council, here in support of the governor's appropriation. As you know, the majority of those funds are distributed through our grant programs, the Rural Maryland Prosperity Investment Fund and the Maryland Agriculture, Education and Rural Development Assistance Fund. Demand for those programs are still high. Last year in fiscal year 24, we received over $20 million in requests. And we've done an economic analysis, so we think we're making an impact. We are able to leverage outside funding to bring them into our rural communities, as well as impact employee compensation. We did have a slight reduction in our appropriation. We received $300,000 through the legislature last year for our Health and Human Services Transportation Program. For our rural areas, we think we have about 76,000 to 82,000 residents who are unable to access needed transportation to address medical needs. It's about 20% of missed appointments are due to lack of access to transportation. But, you know, we know this is a difficult year. Just, you know, you've got some difficult decisions. And so we think, you know, the current resources that we are receiving are going to impact and improve the quality of life in rural Maryland. I brought a copy of our fiscal year 23 annual report. So appreciate your support. We ask you to support the governor's appropriation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you to you both. You're wonderful amplifiers of the department, and we appreciate your partnership with the state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no questions, that's going to conclude our hearing for today, but wait, we are back tomorrow with the DPSCS Administration Office Budget, Maryland Tax Court, and Office of Administrative Hearings. We'll start that at 11:30 a.m. Thank you all very much.